professor when I was studying at Fordham in the years following my ordination. She was a Hindu woman. She was from India. And her husband worked for the United Nations, so they were not here permanently. They were here sort of like on a Lend-Lease program, I guess you could say. She was fascinated with Christianity and fascinated with the Gospels. But she had a great love for St. Francis, and one of the great delights of her life was to be able to go to Assisi one time on her trip back to India. And it was really a kind of an earth-shaking experience for her. And I thought of it today on the Feast of St. Francis. And she saw so many things that just, she said, brought tears to her eyes. She was so moved. But one of the things that moved her so greatly was to see the habit of St. Francis and St. Clare. And she said they were so small. They were like little dolls. And that really, so I spoke to her and I said, what captured your imagination about that? And she said that someone so great should have been contained in such a small space. Was just extraordinary to her. And it's true that Francis, who was actually very diminutive, became such a powerful figure, and is even to our day such a powerful figure. You wonder how so much could be contained in such a small little space, such a small little habit, or such a small little body in the presence of God. And we know that the story of St. Francis could not contain him. Francis became bigger and bigger and bigger. I wonder if sometimes why the Franciscans are always depicted as being so large is because their founder's legend just kept growing and growing and growing. And it was the Franciscans themselves who were in large part responsible for that. Thinking and imagining more situations in which Francis was involved, in which he was touched by the hand of God in some miraculous way, is part of his reality in history. They say that Brother Leo, who was the first to start compiling the legends of St. Francis, kind of the starting impetus behind the little flowers that grew and grew and grew from about 40 at the beginning to over 4,000. The little legends about St. Francis just kept accumulating as people began to imagine more and more. So part of the fecundity of St. Francis was that people began to imagine him in new and ever newer situations in which the hand of God was touching his life and the lives of those with whom he made contact. And that's part of the strength of St. Francis, that he's able to inspire so much in the lives of people. And as I was meditating on Francis this morning and that whole thing about the legends just going overboard almost, I thought about the life of Jesus, and I thought of this little tiny piece of parchment that was supposed to been discovered that talks about Jesus, purportedly talks about Jesus and his wife. If you look at the early years of Christianity after the resurrection of Jesus, as a time in which the power of Jesus, the presence of Almighty God in human form in our midst, and all that transpired as a result of him, through his wondrous miracles and through his passion and death and resurrection, that is it any wonder that Jesus himself would not have inspired even more legends and stories and all the rest than even Francis did. And so these little legends surrounding Jesus just began to abound, and the number of little compilations and little gospels, quasi-gospels, misnamed gospels that abounded in those early centuries after Jesus, containing all kinds of stories. You know, there's one these apocryphal gospels that talks about Jesus when he was a little boy. It was written in the early centuries of Christianity, making little birds out of mud and then throwing them up in the air and having them fly away. These legends abound. And part of the reason for that is that these powerful religious figures, and of course Jesus, the most powerful religious figure in all of history, God incarnate, that they should inspire us, our minds, just to kind of go wild in imagination, imagining all of these things that would have happened to him during the course of his life. Is it any wonder that the Gospels, the four Gospels that we have, try to contain the story of Jesus, at least in some limited form? And they can say people's imaginations are always going to go wild. But at least we have these four sources that we can point to, and we can say, well, we always are going off into fantasy when we leave this. Two things I think are important to remember: that the importance of religious figures to inspire our imagination is something that will always happen. And that's part of their beauty and their bounty. The kind of imagination and the kind of inspiration that we get from a St. Francis, just as the kind of imagination and inspiration that we get from meditating on the life of Jesus, always bear fruit when they cause us to want to live more closely either a Christ-like life or a truly Franciscan life, in the sense of that total dedication and service to the will of God the Father, and a dedication of what you might call a beautiful way of seeing the hand of God, the mighty hand of God, in every event that they encounter, in every person that they meet, in every situation that's placed before them, whether they are happy or sad, whether they're filled with joy or with suffering, to experience the joyful presence of God, the powerful and even miraculous presence of God in all of those things. When the saints and when Jesus himself in the gospel of Jesus inspires us in that way, to change in that way, to become that kind of person that is totally dedicated to God and sees the hand of God wherever they go, then all of that has borne the most perfect fruit of all, because it has created in all of us the possibility of being a saint in God's eyes and in God's presence for all eternity.